Hi, my name's Ewan McGahey, and in Enterprise Law today we are doing the regulation of the military. So I'd like to start with this quote from Vegetius, a Roman general, that if you want peace, prepare for war. Very well-known phrase, but in 390 AD, those were not particularly peaceful times. And as humanity has become less prone to war, more peaceful, less violent, thinking has very much changed in the modern era to how we should approach this question of what we do to get peace. So the treaty at the end of the First World War, a failed treaty in many ways, but it had a successful part 13, ironically, was the Constitution of the International Labour Organization. And there it said that peace can only be established, or can be established only if it is based upon social justice. The idea that for the conditions of peace to prevail, there also needs to be just societies internally, because the causes of external conflict very much depend on social organisation within countries, and socially unjust nations are more likely to go to war than nations where people are clothed, poverty is low, inequality is low, everyone has access to public services, and people can generally fulfill their potential. And then at the end of the Second World War, and another, I think, really important idea is found in the UNESCO Constitution. So, of course, that's the United Nations organization that deals with education. There the preamble says in 1945 that since wars begin in the minds of men, it's in the minds of men that the defences of peace have to be constructed. If we grow up in a society where we're prepared to think that war is inevitable, that we've got to constantly be preparing for war in order to get peace, or think about the First World War. There was a theory that in order for Germany to defend itself, they had to attack France preemptively, according to the Schlieffen Plan, in order to knock out the West before you engage in the war with the East. If you build up mindsets like this, embedding the ideas that wars are unavoidable or inevitable, then that is what can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So because wars begin in the minds of men, it's there that the defences of peace have to be constructed. Ending war within our lifetimes could very much be a reality. It's absolutely true that violence has declined, even though we are still seeing horrific conflicts around the world, notably Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the war crimes committed in Gaza, more recently the wanton and illegal bombing of Iran. War, despite what we see on the television all the time, is declining. But ending war depends on our ability to advance social justice, education, and democracy. So the key issues that we want to look at today are firstly how militaries are publicly financed and what can be done to finance them at a safe level. Very few people would advocate unilateral disarmament. Of course, there is a strong movement for unilateral disarmament for nuclear weapons, for instance, but most people are realistic and see that when we live in a hostile world, there does need to be some form of military. The question is, what is the right balance to have the military at a safe level and ultimately reduce over time? Secondly, who should be controlling military decisions in order to keep us as safe as possible? And thirdly, if rights to security, to life, to peace can really work in law, because violence and war is almost the antithesis of a rules-based order and law itself. So we're going to go through history, looking at technology for war, human rights involved, market, and a little bit on government failures. Secondly, we're going to look at the finance of the military, between public financing, private financing, not paying for externalities, and a new exotic topic of unidentified anomalous phenomena. Thirdly, we're going to look at the governance of the military, the chain of command, and the big arms dealers in the UK and the US. And fourthly, the human rights that are at play in a little bit more detail, such as there is case law on the right to security, the right to life, and the right to peace. So this is how technology has changed in war, and it's been tremendous. And one of the drivers of history, the drivers of technology, has often been conflict. So, when we look at early ancient forms of warfare, people were using anything that they could beat each other up with: sticks, knives, swords. The Romans pioneered a method of killing other people very effectively. This is that you have a small sword depicted in the picture, and that you thrust the sword into your enemy. And that was what Roman soldiers were trained to do, more effective than swiping, much less likely to get a kill. Modern warfare really depends, however, on the bullet. The bullet is a relatively recent invention. It's only the early 19th century. So, if you think back to the English Bill of Rights and the right to bear arms for Protestants, not Catholics, or the more famous Second Amendment in the United States, to the United States Constitution, right to bear arms. Well, bullets weren't actually invented yet. Modern guns were not invented yet. So that's a 19th century thing. And of course, over the later 19th century, bullets and guns, and eventually the machine gun, were one of the most important weapons that were used to subjugate people all around the world, particularly through the British Empire. A famous nasty little poem once went, after all, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not. And so, very real difference in technology produces difference in political power and colonial control. Then we have the development of flight in the early 20th century, not really used so much in the First World War, but in the Second World War, not to mention the Spanish Civil War, used to great and to terrifying effect. We're in London, so you had the Blitz in London. You have bombing all over Russia, all over Germany, Japan during the Second World War, the bombing of Dresden, bombing of Tokyo, appalling firebombs, appalling levels of civilian destruction and death. And really that was what made wars total wars. So before, in most of human history, you had soldiers fighting each other on the battlefield, but war from the skies really brings the terrors of conflict to a whole civilian population. Not to suggest for 1 second that civilians weren't routinely pillaged, murdered, raped throughout human history, but the era of total war has brought a new scale of potential destruction. And of course that culminated in the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima in 1945 with atomic weapons developed through the Manhattan Project. So we've grown up in a nuclear age, under a cloud of threatening war since the Cold War, the end of the Cold War. But now the really big thing is the question of autonomous weapons, and how artificial intelligence behind military equipment can be used in order to potentially kill an awful lot of people. We've got drones up in the sky. There's a picture of a robot dog. So there's no end in sight to the capacity that humanity has to think up new and appalling ways to kill each other. And perhaps even more interesting is some discussion that we'll talk about a bit later about potential for movement into space. So when we think about technology, in fact, all across enterprise law, we see that the military and military conflict drives enormous innovations, just as innovations can drive military technology. So to give you a few examples that we've seen throughout the course, in healthcare, there's, of course, the famous story of Florence Nightingale, the lady with the lamp, who in the Crimean War pioneers the profession of nursing, very simply because she realized that fewer people were going to die if, for instance, they washed their hands. So nursing and care comes out of the Crimean War. You've got a big shift in the energy system when the British Navy decides to shift from coal to oil-powered battleships. The construction industry in medieval times is or the forefront of the construction industry are people building castles for the English campaign, for instance, against the Welsh. Transport is incredibly important to military strategy. The reason that Roman roads were straight is that they could move troops very fast across long distances through them. That was another source of military superiority in the Roman Empire. In the British Empire, train networks knitted the colonies together. So think about the railways crisscrossing the Indian subcontinent. Think about Cecil Rhodes' attempts to build, although he didn't get there, build railroads up the length of Africa. We've got the development of civil aviation, largely off the back of military aviation. Communications in the modern form come from the military. So ARPANET was the US Department of Defense program, which gave us eventually the internet. And media and warfare through information is an inherent part of modern hybrid war. So if we think about Brexit and the Trump votes, well, you had this company called Cambridge Analytica, which had people with a background in military intelligence and intelligence operations, hybrid warfare operations, to sway elections in many countries around the world. They use the same technology of influence in gathering data from people's Facebook accounts before the Brexit poll, before the 2016 presidential election, compiling personalized data and targeting advertisements at people. And the strategies that the Russian government used to influence the 2016 election were being pioneered in the 2014 Ukraine conflict, also being used against some of the Baltic states from 2013. Every form of technology is influential for the military and vice versa. Now let's think a little bit more about some institutional history and some of the details of how people have shifted their thinking about law and regulation in application to the military. So when we go back to ancient times, we see wars of extermination being the norm. One of the first things that human beings, Homo sapiens, did in our early history was kill all the Neanderthal people, a relative of ours as a species. All the Neanderthals died out, and the majority hypothesis appears to be that Homo sapiens killed all the Neanderthals, probably because we had slightly superior intelligence. When you look back at ancient Egypt, the pharaohs were launching wars that were, as a norm, wars of extermination, and we find references to sort of biblical fury and war throughout the Old Testament. On the other hand, we can see in very early on in human history there were attitudes that went in exactly the other direction, emphasizing the need for humanity even in war. Deuteronomy, in striking passage, even shows a concern for the environment. When thou shalt besiege a city, thou shalt not destroy the trees, for the tree is man's life. And what about the people? Well, the book of Isaiah says something about that. Famously, they shall beat their swords into plowshares. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And the statue that is on the right at the top there depicts somebody beating swords into plowshares in the gardens outside the United Nations in New York City. There were also people like Sun Tzu who wrote about the tactics for war. So famous book, often on the shelves of people who do MBAs and business executives and the like. Sun Tzu's Art of War says that good leaders should show wisdom, sincerity, benevolence, courage, and strictness. The art of war for Sun Tzu is that war begins with deception, deceiving the enemy of what you intend to do. And supreme excellence, he says, is breaking the enemy's resistance without any fighting. Not necessarily what you might first think. Don't rush into a conflict, is what Sun Tzu is saying, and he has lots of advice, but making sure that you are well prepared before a conflict is usually key to being able to predict who in fact will win. Preparation is 9/10 of the game. Then we've got a strand of literature beginning in ancient Greece, which is about what we now call realism in international legal theory or international political theory. So Thucydides, in the history of the Peloponnesian War, says that the war between Sparta and Athens really became inevitable because of the growth of the power of Athens. In a striking example of what we see of the realist ideal, Athens surrounds an island allied to Sparta called Melia or Melos, and says to the Melians, we want to take you over. The Melians try to beg and plead and appeal to the Athenians' sense of right and justice, and the Athenians ignore it, take over the island, enslave and kill almost everyone. So that's the reality of power and what international law and when we speak of law, legal system has to grapple with the reality that maybe principles and rights matter less in the face of brute force. On the other hand, we go back to the UNESCO preamble that what human beings can do, because we're not Neanderthals, is we can train ourselves to think in a bit more civilized and enlightened fashion. Now, all throughout history, there were appalling levels of violence and conflict. The Romans were utterly bloodthirsty, genocide, mass killing, massacres, you name it. Rome did it, killing all of Gauls. So you might have read Asterix comics. Well, there was little village left, but mainly because Julius Caesar killed millions and millions and millions of Gauls. The Crusades, an utterly appalling episode of history where the Pope called for an invasion of the Holy Land. The Crusaders that were gathered around Europe to try and take back Jerusalem from the Muslim forces there actually went and killed everybody in Constantinople that was meant to be an ally first, and on in a ghastly few centuries of conflict. Then you had the Mongolian invasion from the east, where Genghis Khan and his successors pioneered invasions through horseback riding and really just killing everybody. They told cities that they were going to invade. If you don't surrender unequivocally, we'll just kill you all. And so either cities did surrender or they were all killed. And so tens of millions of people across Asia were decimated, slaughtered. And then there are pretty harrowing accounts of people going east to try and visit, because they haven't heard anybody. I think one of the accounts is a messenger from the Pope who goes to Russia to see what's happening, and he just finds skulls and bones all the way up the roads because everybody has been killed. So this is the reality. The 100 Years' War, utterly appalling. We don't need to go into all this too much. Columbus's invasion of Central and South America. One of the biggest weapons, of course, that killed everyone there was not the sword, but smallpox. And so, when people arrived from Europe on the shores of the Americas, and people in America didn't have any natural defense to the diseases that the Europeans brought. Well, about 9 out of 10 people died. So this was the norm. This was the reality of international international relations. It wasn't really international relations yet, but this was the reality of human history before the modern era. Now, the birth of international law, and that word nation is actually key, really begins with the end of the 30 Years' War and what's known as the Peace of Westphalia. So states within the Holy Roman Empire, not so holy, not so Roman, not really an empire, were at war, appalling level of conflict. But it was brought to an end in the Peace of Westphalia. And Hugo Grotius proposed a couple of basic principles. One is that national sovereignty should be protected. And the second one is that nations did not interfere with other nations. So the birth of the nation is really the shift away from empires being the basic unit, where if you're a ruler, you try to rule everything in the known world. But here was the idea that there could be coexistence of different nations side by side, respecting that they wouldn't interfere in each other's affairs. And of course, all of this previously had been driven by religious conflicts following the Reformation, but non-interference was founded as the new norm then. Across the colonies, across the world, outside Europe, the colonial empires were built through companies. So we've seen this before. The East India Company, founded in 1600, Royal Africa Company, 1660, largely responsible for the early transatlantic slave trade. This is the means by which people around the world were subjugated and colonized. Of course, one of the colonies in the United States, what became the United States, declared independence in 1776, drafted a new Bill of Rights based on the English Bill of Rights of 1689, and founded what was meant to be the basis of a republic that might eventually become democratic. Now, around this time, and then you've also got the French Revolution going on, around this time, Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher, wrote a very important tract called On Perpetual Peace. We'll get to that in just a second. But Napoleon, at the end of the 18th century, got to power too in France, continued in his role as emperor until 1814, and then again afterwards for a bit over 1850. Now, before we get back to Kant, I just wanted to show you this chart on people killed as a percentage of all deaths by era. What this chart shows is the number of people who were killed by other people as a percentage of people dying overall has gone down quite a lot in modern times. So if we look at the end, we've got the contemporary era. The number of what we call conspecific deaths is at an all-time low. The most violent period in history where people are killing other people is the colonization of the New World. So now, if you don't want to be killed in a war, despite what we see on the news all the time, now is a decent time to be living. But how could we get to a world where we have, in Immanuel Kant's terms, perpetual peace? Well, Immanuel Kant in 1795 proposed a list of 9 things. He said that peace could last by disposing of materials for war, by ending colonization, abolishing standing armies, ending international debts between countries, a principle that states do not attack other states, and adopting basic rules of war such as not poisoning each other. And then also, Immanuel Kant said for internal organization, states should uphold principles of freedom, the rule of law, and equality. international law should see the world as a federation of free states, and there should be universal hospitality for citizens of the world. Now, I think this is so interesting because when we look at the actual development of international law today, we can see that we have just about done most of these things that Kant recommended. So if we go from the bottom up, is there universal hospitality for citizens of the world? Well, yes, those principles are recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. International law explicitly sees different countries as being sovereign, like a federation of free states, and it's in the name United Nations. Freedom, rule of law, equality are essential principles in the Universal Declaration. We've got things like the Geneva Conventions that give us basic rules even in wartime. We have a principle in the United Nations Charter that no state should attack another state aggressively. And of course, we've got examples like the invasion of Ukraine or the invasion of Iraq or now the bombing of Iran. But these things are the exception to what is actually a modern era without too much aggressive war, certainly compared to before. We haven't ended international debt. We have only partly abolished standing armies. We'll talk about that more. We have largely ended colonization. Of course, there are one or two salient examples, notably Israel's continued occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. And we haven't disposed of materials for war. However, we have the non-proliferation treaties surrounding nuclear weapons, another partial examples. So I think that's important to keep in mind as we go forward. There is very much a set of theories behind what we've done in international law, and from Kant's perspective, we're not too far off completing what he would have had in his list. But we certainly haven't completed what Kant wanted, and in the modern era, there have been no end of appalling conflicts. So the 19th century was dominated by the British Empire. There was a theory of Pax Britannica, that actually the 19th century was relatively peaceful after the defeat of Napoleon. But that theory doesn't really stack up to reality because you had colonial wars fought all across the globe. One of the worst examples is what was known as the Indian Mutiny in 1857. People in the Indian Army, in India, partly in the army, rose up or mutinied. And the rebellion was violently put down, 1 million people dead throughout India in 1857 to 1858. And the violence was so bad and it exposed the corruption and mismanagement of the East India Company to such a great degree that the government in London decided to effectively nationalise the East India Company's functions through the Government of India Act 1858. Not much better, you might say, from an Indian perspective, from the perspective of democracy and liberation, but nevertheless a big shift. You also had the US Civil War in 1861 to 65. Of course, this was caused by the secession of the southern states from the United States, partly to protect the ability to keep slaves. The North declared war, led by Abraham Lincoln, and this is where you had the first modern trench warfare. 1 million people died in the Civil War. So, the British Empire was dominant throughout the 19th century. It had an empire supposedly on which the sun never set, and the joke goes, well, that's because God wouldn't trust the English in the dark. When we got to the beginning of the 20th century, it turned out there was another country called Germany that wanted its place in the sun as well. And this call by the Kaiser, Wilhelm, for Germany's place in the sun is what really led to the First World War, the war to end all wars, with Germany's attacking of neutral Belgium, and the invasion of France and Britain joining the war. So between 1914 and 1918, 30 million people were killed. It ended with Germany's surrender and the signing of the Versailles Treaty in 1919. Really, that was precipitated in turn by a mutiny within the German, beginning in the German Navy, naval workers going on strike. Germany was really brought to its knees by hunger, by lack of pay, people being impoverished, absolutely appalling, and that's what led to the collapse of the army, the takeover of the Social Democratic government, and the negotiation of the Versailles Treaty. Around the same time, you had a sort of centrist thinker, political philosopher called Max Weber, who said that the state is defined by having a legitimate monopoly on the means of violence. Now, that might have partly been true at the time, but also in this era, after the end of the First World War and with the creation of the Versailles Treaty, it was the beginning of the end for that concept, because the Versailles Treaty set up the world's first human rights, namely to labour rights such as an 8-hour workday, fair conditions at work, fair pay, equal treatment between men and women. And so, it was with the birth of international human rights, you had the end of the state having a legitimate monopoly on the means of violence. Of course, Germany was soon rearming again because of the First World War's settlement in the Versailles Treaty. The Versailles Treaty imposed reparations on Germany to repay the cost of the First World War. Germany's economy could not cope. It suffered periods of hyperinflation, instability, and the industrialists in Germany decided that in order to end this and restore Germany's greatness, it would fund a man called Adolf Hitler, gave him 1 million Deutschmarks to fight and ultimately win the 1933 election. Hitler promised them that if you want to make capitalism safe, then you've got to destroy democracy and the trade unions, and certainly get rid of all the communists and anyone on the socialist or democratic wing of the country. All had to be smashed. That's precisely what happened under the Hitler regime, and famously he promised everyone that they would get total war, and that's exactly what happened. So Hitler invaded Poland, carved up Poland with the Soviet Union. Stalin, in control of the Soviet Union, thought that he had a deal with Hitler. Can't trust a fascist, though, so it wasn't long before Hitler invaded the Soviet Union as well. And of course, America was brought into the war when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and Hitler unilaterally announced that they would be at war with the United States as well. So that was total war, known from the Russian perspective as the Great Patriotic War, because so many people died in the Eastern Front. That's where the war in Europe really was. 70 million people in total all around the world, ending with the Manhattan Project and 2 atomic weapons. So after the Second World War, humanity wanted to ensure that this never happened again. For the untold sorrow that twice in our lifetimes has blighted humanity, the people who'd seen this wrote the United Nations Charter with an absolute prohibition on aggressive war. And then there was the Universal Declaration to set up a system of human rights to ensure that people lived well in each country, so that you didn't fall into an authoritarian regime, or the people didn't turn to an authoritarian leader like Hitler for solutions. Of course, although we haven't had a Third World War, we have had many appalling conflicts nevertheless. There was the Cold War immediately beginning after the Second World War was over. with the development of nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union just engaged with America in an arms race to build ever more atomic weapons. And although everyone could see that there would be mutually assured destruction, which would be mad, there were proxy conflicts all around the world. So we had the Korean War against communist North Vietnam and capitalist South Vietnam. You have the same idea, communist Korea, North Vietnam, communist North, capitalist South. Use of napalm, chemical weapons, mass killing of forests as the war spread to Cambodia. We've had the Iraq conflict spilling over into an appalling war in Syria. The Iraq conflict, of course, began with the US and the United Kingdom's invasion, which was quite flatly illegal, contrary to international law. We've had more recently the Ukraine invasion by Russia, 600,000 people dead so far at the last count, 80,000 people killed in Gaza after Israel's retaliation, and people on both sides of the Israel-Gaza conflict have been indicted for war crimes by the International Criminal Court. On the Hamas side, I think one of the leaders is already dead. On the Israel side, there's Benjamin Netanyahu, who is very much in power, indicted for war crimes. Then the other player is the arms industry. So after World War II, the president that follows on from Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, says that one of the big things that we've got to worry about is the growth of a military-industrial complex, because if you have arms dealers that are profiting from war, and they're also lobbying people in politics to go to war, then this can be very good for business, and that's not something that we should want. So, against the incredible power that exists behind a for-profit war industry, you have very, very tepid attempts to try and restrict arms manufacturing. But one of the most successful is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1970. We also have a series of bans through the Geneva Conventions and amendments on biological and chemical weapons. We have a nuclear comprehensive test ban treaty completed in 1996. But with the Iraq War, there was a growth in private military contracting firms. Donald Rumsfeld famously says that we're going to outsource absolutely everything that we can. Now, the really big risk today is artificial intelligence. So what are the human rights that are affected? I think, not to make it too complicated, the main ones are ones that we see time and again in Universal Declaration, International Covenants, European Convention, European Union Fundamental Rights Charter. Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. So, the military, on the one hand, most of us would acknowledge is necessary for security if we face threats from an outside aggressor. It is necessary to protect life. But on the other hand, the paradox is that if we have big military manufacturing bases, then that creates a very powerful lobby for war and potentially can create wars because of its existence. So, having a military is not something that automatically gets you security. It depends very much on how it is being used and what can be done in cooperation with countries all around the world. Now, I think another dimension that we have to keep in mind is that military spending has declined as a proportion of GDP at the same time as human development has improved. So what this chart shows is human development on one axis from 1960 up until I think that's about 2014, 2015. And on the other axis, it's got UK military spending as a GDP, as a percentage of GDP. Now, You might say, well, correlation does not equal causation, and that is absolutely true. Just because military spending has gone down, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's what caused human development to rise. But I think everybody would acknowledge that very simply, if we plough an extra 4% of our GDP every year into building guns and bombs, that's 4% extra GDP, which is not going into health, education, infrastructure, and other things that will raise people's standards of living. What are the market failures that exist around the military? Now, this might seem like a bit of a counterintuitive question, because when we think about the military, we think that it's mainly state-led. But of course, that's not actually how, for quite a lot of modern history, militaries actually worked. Main example being the British East India Company or the Royal Africa Company. So these were private military forces. They were companies, they had their own militaries, and it's not exactly a market because the East India Company had monopoly, but you get the picture that it's possible to imagine a world where you just left the military to private ownership and competition, such as there could be. But I think that the first problem that you'd face if you do that is that there is natural monopoly at play. So I mentioned Max Weber already, that he comes up with this idea that the state is that which has a legitimate monopoly on violence. That's not true any longer because we have international human rights. We don't accept anymore that states have a legitimate monopoly on violence because everyone has a right to life, whether or not the state that they are living in it likes it or not. That doesn't necessarily mean that their rights can be enforced, but there is a limit on what states can legitimately do. The societies that we live in are not, we think today, in sole control of our bodies and our liberty and our security. However, all this said, we can say that the military has very strong natural monopoly features. Because if there are rival centres of power, they are likely to conflict, and the strongest one is likely to win. And also, states are by far the best placed actors to do the massive investment that is necessary for defence capability, and also the best placed actors to ensure that defence capabilities are not misused and human rights are upheld. So the very high capital costs lead to a natural monopoly, and it is cheaper for one organisation, one state, to do the work of the military and defence than many competing organisations. Second market failure is very simply death, destruction, climate damage, and so on. Third market failure is that the military is a public good. So if you have an air force that is defending in World War II the whole of Britain during the Blitz, then the defence work that the fighters shooting down German planes or stopping German bombs is doing is creating benefits that are non-rivalrous and non-excludable. So fighters shot out of the sky means that people aren't bombed, and there's no easy way to capture the revenue of that. And so that's why it's seen as a government function, so public good. We also have irrationality. So individual people can, of course, make very unwise decisions. States, corporations, artificial intelligence can too. But organizations are much more likely than human beings, individuals, to embed rational decision-making processes. I don't want to exaggerate this point too much. I think it's important to see that corporations, states, artificial intelligence can be incredibly irrational as well, but that will be because they're replicating the flaws in individual human thinking. So states, corporations, AI are all ways to accentuate the strengths of what human beings underlying them do, and also the flaws. So corporations can embed a kind of rationality which maximizes to make profit ruthlessly without regard to the social costs. This might be terrible, but it is doing what it is programmed to do. The same with a computer algorithm. And then we've got macroeconomic failures. So when we have wars, it's very likely that we also get a whole set of deleterious economic consequences flowing on. Inflation, unemployment are very common. That's exactly what's happening right now with the US-Israel bombing of Iran. It's led to a spike in oil and gas prices as Iran has retaliated, shut down the Strait of Hormuz. We saw this after the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, huge spike in gas prices. We saw hyperinflation after World War One. Unemployment unless there's positive social action. So, macroeconomic consequences and bad things happening generally follow on from war. I should just add, perhaps because it'll be a point of interest, it's often said that Hitler got everybody working again. They got full employment in Germany after the Depression through Hitler's militarization of society. But of course, the full employment that people got in the war was at an appalling cost of so many people, millions of people dying. Death in the trenches, death in the air raids, death on the battlefield. And so it's not really possible to say that war and its destructive consequences can in any way be good for the macro economy. Now, because the military is so intertwined with governments and is led by the state, although we're going to see some exceptions, I think it's also useful to talk about government failures in this regard. Government success in the field of military is not having a conflict. I think that most people would agree on that, unless, of course, it is in self-defense. Democracies are much, much less likely to go to war with each other and are much less likely to launch aggressive wars against one another. Countries that are authoritarian or have authoritarian tendencies are much more likely to go to war with each other and are much more likely to launch aggressive wars. So I think that's an empirically valid statement. I wouldn't say that it's absolute. We might be able to pick up find some exceptions depending on how we define what a democracy is, depending on how we define what an aggressive war is, but it is pretty close to the truth. However, governments, and I think this is the new part that I want to put forward to you, governments that are captured by corporate profit are more likely than others to launch expansionist wars. And I'll just give you four main examples of that. The first, an easy one, is the British East India Company. So they are making money, literally, from colonizing ever greater parts of the Indian subcontinent. You have the British Empire, which is run through Parliament from a series of politicians who have wealthy connections to those throughout the colonies and the empire, the financiers. So an empire run on money and supposedly on free trade is likely to be expansionist, likely to launch more wars. The Second Reich in Germany was controlled through a three-class voting system. Like Britain at the time, it was not democratic, so working class people could not vote. If you're rich, you got more votes. If you're middle class, you got sort of a medium amount of votes. If you're working class, you had almost no voice at all. And this was the style of government that was responsible for launching the First World War, on top of its similar colonial adventures throughout Africa. You have Nazi Germany. So really important to see that Hitler was not just there because of his supposedly amazing oratory. He was there because he won the backing and the funding of the German industrialists who had felt humiliated after the end of the First World War. So he got, along with the Conservative Party, a million Deutschmarks to fight the 1933 election. In fact, the Nazis were really the party that pioneered outspending all other parties in elections because at that time the Weimar Republic didn't have laws to restrict expenditure. So Hitler was a product of big business. And today we have the degradation of American democracy. The US political system is not really capable of representing its voters on any level anymore. A well-known article by Gillens and Page says that American public policy has not borne any relationship to voters' preferences since they began their study in 1980. And that's because, as we know, the US political system is dominated by big money. The US Supreme Court said in Buckley and Valeo in 1986 that people can spend an unlimited amount of money on their election campaigns. And through a series of cases, Bellotti, Citizens United, the US Supreme Court strengthens this idea. And so now you can have unlimited amounts of corporate money being spent largely in secret through super PACs on political causes or candidates in any way that people want. And so when we think about the financial interest behind the George W. Bush presidency from 2000 to 2008 and the launch of the war in Iraq, well, you see a host of oil executives, particularly from Halliburton. If you look at the Trump administration now, we see people behind the Trump administration that have a whole series of very large financial incentives to go to war. For instance, Peter Thiel's Palantir, which is making many of the systems that are being tried and tested in the battlefield, artificial intelligence in the military. So governments fail when they don't respond to the people that they are meant to be representing. When you've got failures of democracy, like in these four examples, but we could have a lot more, then you're more likely, I would suggest, to see aggressive wars. So democracy and social justice within countries are essential preconditions for peace. Right, so let's look at the finance of the military now. First of all, Parliament's consent for taxation. Second, private procurement and corruption. Thirdly, finance through not paying for death and destruction. Fourthly, climate damage. And fifthly, the fun topic of unidentified anomalous phenomena. So first point is that Parliament must consent to, in the UK, have spending on the military. In the last budget, 2025, the UK is spending £90 billion a year, which is coming up to 2.5% of GDP. America spends much more, $848 billion, which is around 3.4% of GDP. And NATO used to have a target that we were not reaching before of 2% spending, but since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia and a conference at The Hague last year in 2025, NATO is telling member countries to spend 5% of GDP on the military by 2035. Now, I think it's very important to see that we don't live in a safe world. A country like Russia very clearly is threatening many of its neighbors, indeed has attacked the United States through hybrid warfare, leading to the Trump election, documented in the Mueller report in 2016. They pose a threat to countries across Western Europe. However, putting the percentage of military spending up to 5% necessarily comes with trade-offs. and it means less money for health, education, and one does wonder whether that money might be spent better accelerating the shift towards renewable energy, which is at the heart of so many conflicts as we know it. The principle that Parliament has to consent for spending and for keeping a military comes from the Bill of Rights 1689. So, in fact, two things. First of all, no tax without Parliament, but second of all, no military without Parliament. So Clause 6 of the Bill of Rights says, the keeping or raising of a standing army within the kingdom in time of peace, unless it be with consent of Parliament, is against the law. So every year since the Mutiny Act of 1689, and now it's a practice of every 5 years, we have renewed authority for the Army, the Navy, the Air Force to exist. For instance, the Armed Forces Act of 2021. So instead of having standing or abolition of standing armies, what we've actually got is Parliament giving standing authority for the army to exist. How many troops do we have? Well, it's 137,000 active servicemen and women. In the Army, there's 74,000, Navy 32, Air Force 30,000, and then there's 32,000 in the reserve forces. People in the military are not paid a huge amount of money. If you start training as a private, you get a salary of 26,000 a year, although that has come up significantly in the last few years. And if you're a lance corporal, you get promoted. Then it can rise to 34,000. Now, when we look around the world, the UK is pretty far down in who are the big spenders. So there's the UK there in orange, I think. So that's Germany, France, Saudi Arabia, Russia, India, China, and of course the biggest spender in the military in the world is the United States. A second way in which the military is funded is through the systems of procurement and also by getting extra business through corrupt practices. So BAE Systems is the biggest arms dealer in the UK. It was privatised by Margaret Thatcher. One of her first acts of privatisation was to sell off BAE shares. The British Aerospace Act of 1980 set up this system, and it said that the UK government would guarantee the liabilities of BAE Systems if it ever did go insolvent. The shares were sold off by 1986, but the UK government still retains what we call a golden share, which allows it to intervene. And this could be used in a range of situations, but the most important one would be to stop a takeover bid by a foreign power that the UK government did not think was compatible with military or security objectives. An example of corruption in the arms industry is seen vividly in the case Corner House Research and the Serious Fraud Office. So in 2008, it was alleged, although quite very likely to have happened, that the company, British Aerospace Enterprises, bribed Saudi Arabian officials to get an arms deal known as the Al Yamamah deal for the princely sum of £135 million. Now, the Serious Fraud Office of the United Kingdom opened up an investigation in 2006, but then once that happened, the Saudis threatened to cancel orders that they'd made and to end security cooperation. So, in response, Prime Minister Tony Blair at the time pressured the Serious Fraud Office to drop the investigation because of national security concerns. And the question for the House of Lords was whether this was a violation of the rule of law. It being alleged that the executive can make an administrative agency stop an investigation. That means that the rule is not being applied equally. And this is a violation of the principle of the rule of law. House of Lords holds that it wasn't, and that meant that the serious fraud did not get investigated by the UK authorities. However, quite embarrassingly, the United States government then decided, under the Department of Justice, that it would investigate. It found that British Aerospace management had lied and that the company was guilty of bribery, giving it a $400 million fine under the Corrupt Practices Act, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of the United States. With its tail between its hind legs, the UK government procured the Bribery Act 2010 to try and signal that the UK actually did take bribery seriously. But I think that we should probably not be so naive as to think that bribery doesn't go on all around the world. BAE Systems is the 7th biggest arms dealer, at least according to this chart. Might have changed a bit in 2020. And you can see that the top 5 arms dealers in the world are American. Lockheed Martin, Boeing, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon, or RTX, as it's been called, renamed today. And very likely is that there's bribery going on all over the world. And you might be slightly suspicious at the Department of Justice launching a bribery investigation into a British company, very good for American competitors who might well be doing the same things in other places but not being investigated by the US Department of Justice. Then we've got the military contractors, so private companies, not arms dealers, but providing actual security services, men and guns in the battlefield or anywhere that the military might be. So the number of private military contractors exploded with the Iraq War, and a few famous or notorious incidents took place with them. So in 2007, Blackwater, which is now known as Academy, killed 17 civilians and injured 24 people in Nisaw Square in Baghdad. In 2009, G4S, an armour group, shot 2 people in a drunken brawl in Iraq. And then it turned out one of the people involved had previous convictions for robbery and holding firearms. Under the Geneva Conventions and on international law, states have responsibility for private groups if they are under their control. So we see that in the Nicaragua and the United States case about the Contras. They were said to be the American government, the CIA, was said to be in effective control of their operations, and therefore it would follow that they have responsibility. And in another case, Ilascu and Moldova, Russian military support was being given to Moldovan separatists, and the European Court of Human Rights found that they were under the effective control of the Russian government, which had decision-level influence over them. Not paying for death and destruction is another way in which military enterprises are financed. A country gets bombed after an invasion, and who pays for the cost of all the damage that's been done? Well, with the Iraq War, it was theorized by the US Deputy Defense Secretary and the US government at the time, expressed here by Paul Wolfowitz, that Iraq can really finance its own reconstruction and relatively soon. The reality was very different, that after the invasion and bombing of Iraq, the country still hasn't been reconstructed, and much of the aid that was sent by the US government vanished in an orgy of theft. So in just one documented case, $12 billion in aid was sent in 2007, and it all seemed to disappear, not being used on projects such as rebuilding hospitals and schools, roads, energy infrastructure that had been destroyed during the war. The Export Control Act of 2002, Section 1, requires that to export arms you need a license. And so we see this in the Campaign Against the Arms Trade and Secretary of State for International Trade case in 2019. So here we had arms being sold to the Saudi Arabians again, which were then being used, arms from us, in Britain, which were then being used by the Saudis in a war against the Houthis in Yemen. Civilians were being bombed. The Saudis were carrying out a campaign of mass starvation And so this was a systematic set of breaches of international law, international humanitarian law, war crimes being committed by the Saudis in their war on Yemen. So the Campaign Against Arms Trade claimed that there shouldn't be arms being sold if the arms were being used to perpetuate violations of international law. And because the Secretary of State awards a license for the selling or licenses the selling of arms, then it had to use its powers to make sure that the license conditions were compliant with international law. And the Court of Appeal held that the UK must indeed review, under its license powers, whether exports might be used or could be used in violation of international law. The problem was that the remedy being granted by the Court of Appeal was not very effective. They were just telling the government to go away and look at it instead of telling the government to do what they should have done, which is stop the sale of arms to Saudi Arabia. The government review was conducted by the minister at the time, who was somebody called Liz Truss, who of course was Prime Minister for 43 days, one of the most useless, damaging prime ministers that sent the economy into a crash. Well, her record wasn't particularly good when she was Secretary of State either. She had found the review that was conducted under her found that Saudi Arabia has a genuine intent and the capacity to comply with international humanitarian law, which is an absolutely insane finding, not least because 9 months before that happened, the Saudi government had kidnapped and chopped up, killed a Washington Post journalist called Jamal Khashoggi in its Istanbul embassy. So the UK armed forces also don't pay a lot of the time for injuries that take place as a result of the conduct of its war. That there is some compensation that we'll get to for service personnel, but before the compensation schemes that we've got now were developed, there's been a long line of the UK Defence Department denying that it has a responsibility that we would ordinarily recognise in tort or in any other workplace. And of course, the army is not a normal workplace, but the UK Armed Forces Covenant says that the whole nation has a moral obligation to the members of the army who deserved our respect and support and fair treatment. So that's what the Armed Forces Covenant says. But when we look at how the Ministry of Defence acts in court, when we're not looking at a public document, the behaviour does seem somewhat different. So Mulcahy, the Ministry of Defence claimed that it had to pay no compensation to Mulcahy, who was injured by a howitzer. The Court of Appeal agreed that there is no negligence liability in combat. So you got somebody injured at work by a howitzer, the employer does not need to compensate them in tort. On the other hand, in Smith and Ministry of Defence, the Ministry of Defence was arguing that it had no duty to protect soldiers against foreseeable risks, for instance, roadside bombs, and there was no breach of the duty to right to life. But the UK Supreme Court held that the Convention's jurisdiction extended wherever control and authority extended, so in principle there could be claims for breaches of human rights. But really what we're talking about is making sure that soldiers who are injured get fully compensated for their service. So much more effective than perhaps tort litigation is the Armed and Reserve Forces Compensation Order 2011. So for instance, if you need a root canal, sort of one of the more minor items, then £3,000 compensation can be paid. If you have very severe burns to 70% or more of your body, then you get around £300,000. If you have loss of arms and legs, £650,000. But of course, for people who are involved in conflict and have these kind of horrific injuries, that might seem like a very small and insignificant sum of money compared to the loss of your future livelihood. I think most poetically, President Eisenhower puts the issue like this. When we pay for war, when we pay for destruction, it's not just about the things that we lose directly, whether that's life or limb or property. It's also about the opportunity cost. He said in a speech called The Chance of Peace in 1953, the cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. It is 2 electric power plants, each serving a town of 60,000 population. It is 2 fine, fully equipped hospitals. This is not a way of life at all in any true sense. Under a cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron. So, the biggest thing that is going into the finance of the military is money from future opportunities that people around the world could have, which is taken away from them and instead being put into guns and bombs. And that's what Eisenhower is saying here. And of course, Eisenhower was a general in the Second World War, but somebody who I think neatly illustrates the importance of ensuring that we live in a world with more peace and less war. Then we've got financing through not paying through climate change. So just a few points here. The Department of Defense in the US is the world's single biggest user of fossil fuels, in other words, the Pentagon. However, they have recognized in a document from 2015 that climate change is probably one of the biggest causes, or likely to be one of the biggest causes of conflict in the coming future. It's the most urgent and growing threat to our national security, so the Department of Defense, contributing to increased disasters, refugee flows, and conflicts over basic resources such as food and water, and projected to increase over time. And there's obviously no shortage of wars about fossil fuels. So the Iraq conflict is the most obvious recent war that was, almost explicitly launched in order to get Iraq's oil. But when we look at previous conflicts, for instance, in the Second World War, we also see the importance of oil there too. So why did the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor? The answer was because it wanted to knock out the US Navy that could threaten Japan's energy supplies. Why did Hitler go to Stalingrad and spend so much resources, so kill so many soldiers trying to take Stalingrad? Well, because it was seen as, rightly, one of the gateways to the Caucasus region, where the Soviet Union had much of its oil supplies. On Iraq, of course, Tony Blair, the UK Prime Minister, said many times that it's absurd to think that the war in Iraq was about oil. He maintained that it was about weapons of mass destruction, even though none were ever found, and the intelligence agencies were saying at the time that they weren't there. Tony Blair says that we probably could have cut a deal with Saddam Hussein tomorrow in relation to the oil. The problem was that the US perspective and its reasons for launching the war are very different to Tony Blair's. It's not realistic to think that the US government shares the same perspective that Tony Blair and his sort of messianic attitude to launching the Iraq war was the same. I think also useful to think about Putin and Vladimir Putin and his sort of psychological or intellectual background. Putin was a law student and wrote, I think it's a master's thesis, which was primarily about how Russia could be made great again. So when he was a young man, long before he got near political, or maybe as he was approaching political power, he wrote a thesis saying that the way Russia could restore itself after the collapse of the Soviet Union was by exploiting its natural resources, its metals, coal, oil, gas, and effectively becoming a petrostate that exported all of these things around the world. And if you think about Russia's foreign policy and its the importance that it attaches to the continuation of fossil fuels, this explains a lot. It also explains why Putin himself has consistently supported political parties around the world that tried to back through active measures that deny climate change and want to promote fossil fuels, including Donald Trump, of course, and also Le Pen, Brexit Party, UKIP, or Nigel Farage, the AFD, all these parties that Russia has given support to over the years are fossil fuel deniers, and that is consistent with Russia's own perspective and its reliance on fossil fuels and the need to keep the price up. Somebody who doesn't have a filter, of course, is Donald Trump himself, and he said about the Iraq war, obviously, I always said just take the oil, and I think that is probably one of the few occasions on which he's telling the truth. Now, fifth source of finance, and I've got a special hat to talk about this one, my tinfoil hat. You might think that this is all a joke, but very really there's a new discussion taking place right now in the last few years about what we're calling now unidentified anomalous phenomena, otherwise known or better known as UFOs, unidentified flying objects. Now, before you switch off or skip ahead or write a letter to the university that I've gone mad, there is a piece of legislation, a piece of proposed law called the Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena Act of 2023, passed or that was proposed by a group of senators in the United States Senate and very high-level ranking senators, Senator Schumer, Gillibrand, Rubio, Mike Rounds. Schumer, of course, was the minority Democrat leader. Marco Rubio, of course, is now the Secretary of State, senior Republican. And the act said that Congress should investigate any information that the executive branch had on objects that cannot be identified due to, in the Act's words, properties not previously known to be achievable based on the commonly accepted physical principles. And there's more about the Act and the proposals, an excellent article by Yang in Legislation and Public Policy, a law review. So what's going on is that more and more people have been coming publicly forward who work in the military, saying that they have seen alien spacecraft, extraterrestrial spacecraft. And there was a government program set up to investigate, a secret government program about the retrieval of alien spacecraft. So one of the whistleblowers, Luis Elizondo of the United States Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, or ATIP, was working on this program to investigate something called the Legacy Program, which was apparently set up by the CIA to retrieve alien alien crash spaceships. And retrieve them and reverse engineer them. So ATIP was meant to investigate whether there was anything true. Luis Elizondo worked there from 2007 to 2012. Then the program was wound up, although it might have continued for a few years. And he testified under oath to the House of Representatives in 2004, saying the following: that advanced technologies are monitoring sensitive military installations around the globe. The US is in possession of UAP technologies, in other words, alien technologies, as are some of our adversaries, namely Russia and China. We are not alone in the cosmos. And then he answers yes to the questions of whether the US has secret crash retrieval programs that were designed to identify and reverse engineer alien craft. So he's testified publicly about these sort of basic facts. He also says that he's bound by military secrecy against revealing anything more. Now, it's not just this guy. There's a whole lot of them. So there was another hearing in the House of Representatives in 2025 with a whole group of people. Lots of whistleblowers have come forward. And here are some examples. So in September 2025, US Air Force veteran Jeffrey Nucatelli testified in the US House of Representatives that in 2003 at Vandenberg Air Base, which is in California, Boeing contractors reported a massive glowing red square silently hovering over two missile defense sites. After several minutes, it drifted further east and then vanished over the hills. And then he spoke to 5 witnesses who saw a massive triangular craft larger than a football field that hovered silently for about 45 seconds over their entry control point before shooting away at impossible speed. In 2005, all on the same airbase, another patrol reported a massive triangular craft bigger than a Lockheed Martin C-130 Hercules air transport. In 2005 as well, he says he himself saw a 200-foot craft over my house. It was 30-foot diameter sphere of light. My friends and I watched it for a moment, and then it gently accelerated and traveled up and disappeared into the stars. The question, says Nucatelli, is no longer whether these events are real, but whether we have the courage to face them. Same hearing, somebody else in the Navy, different posting, who's working on a ship called USS Jackson, says that in 2023 he saw a self-luminous tic-tac shaped object emerge from the ocean before linking up with 3 other similar objects and then disappeared instantaneously with high synchronized near instantaneous acceleration. And a third whistleblower testified to the same US House hearing called Dylan Borland. He used to work for BAE Systems, US intelligence. He was at Langley Air Force Base in summer 2012, and at 1:30 a.m. he says, I saw approximately 100-foot equilateral triangle take off from near the NASA hangar. I was under this triangular craft for a few minutes, and then it rapidly ascended to commercial jet level in seconds, displaying 0 kinetic disturbance, sound, or displacement. The reason I'm doing this and telling you about it in finance is because, well, firstly, there is a connection to law because we've got a proposed law. But if the allegations are true that the US military is in possession of extraterrestrial spacecraft and it's attempting to work out what the technology is, then part of its military developments are effectively being financed by free alien spacecraft that extraterrestrials have either crashed or landed here for us to try and figure out. Now, I'm going to take off my tinfoil hat, put it down here, and go back to the... I mean, you might all think this is mad, but I think that there's a very real set of questions here. So, first of all, if the witness accounts are true, and there's certainly a lot of them, it suddenly makes humanity's conflicts appear very small and profoundly beside the point. And so what would be the implications of us finding and believing what these witnesses are saying? I think there would be 3 main things. First of all, we should settle our now very small, seemingly irrelevant, existing pointless conflicts around the globe. Why on earth is humanity fighting each other if we are part of a much bigger universe and there is extraterrestrial life? It opens up so many questions beyond what seem like very temporary conflicts. Secondly, we should do a lot better to organize ourselves as a human species, rapidly to realize all human potential through global education, health, energy, transport, a job guarantee, social security, communications, and investment. And thirdly, accelerate research and development, investment for fusion energy, space travel, and open up all state security secrets for public research. Now, that's if the witness accounts are true. I think it's important to take it seriously. If they are telling the truth, then I think these are the main implications that follow. We would have to think very differently about what we're doing on this planet and change accordingly. If the witness accounts are not true, in other words, there are no extraterrestrial spacecraft, there is no such thing as faster than light travel that explains how they got here, there's no government reverse engineering and crash retrieval program, then I think it's the wrong lesson to draw that we should continue military conflicts, that we should continue fighting each other, that global poverty and inequality is something that we can just continue not doing anything about. If we are alone in the cosmos, if we're isolated for now, then this underlines the precious and unique nature of life that we have on Earth, and we should see that what we should be doing is everything to enable everyone to live their lives to the fullest on this planet while we have them. So that is, I think, a couple of different perspectives you could take from the question of UAP. Now, thirdly, governance. I want to talk about three things here. So firstly, the military chain of command. Second of all, how UK arms dealers work. And thirdly, say a little bit about the US arms dealers and the military and tech industrial complex. First of all, the army and the military is governed in a very top-down chain of command manner. So what we do in enterprise law is talk about governance a lot and talk about the stakeholders involved in governance. And we look at interesting examples about how different stakeholders, staff, service users, the public can play a positive role in deciding how enterprises are run. So there can be sort of bottom-up level governance. The military is totally the opposite and probably needs to be the opposite for reasons of operational capability. Very different fighting a war than it is running a water company. So the chain of command in the military is this. Parliament sits at the top, and that's where you ultimately get the voice of the people. Parliament then chooses the Prime Minister. So the Prime Minister is somebody who can command the majority in the House of Commons. The Prime Minister then chooses and can remove the Secretary of State for Defence. And the Secretary of State for Defence organises a Defence Council, which is composed of the Admiralty Board, the Army Board, and the Air Force Board. The Defence Council is made up of the Defence Ministers and the Chiefs of Staff, Chiefs of Defence Staff. So that's the sort of command operation, and through the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, the chain of command goes down from the Defence Council and the Admiralty Board and so on to the frontline soldier. And then you've got oversight from Cabinet. So in Cabinet, there's the Subcommittee on Overseas and Defence, which is chaired by the Prime Minister. In the House of Commons, you've got a Committee on National Security, and there's also exercising oversight, the Committee on Public Accounts and the Committee on Defence. So this chain is direct, it can't be broken, and a useful confirmation of that in Miller is that Parliament cannot be shut down or prorogued by executive order. So the Prime Minister doesn't exercise control over Parliament, Parliament exercises control over the executive, and so on down. And that, I think, is a very important part, not just for the military, but more widely for how the constitutional structure works. It's generally seen in the literature as well that it's essential for democracies to be in ultimate control of the military, so that you have represented the whole of society's will, not simply the will of the incumbent president or prime minister, in the words of Cohn in the Journal of Democracy in 1997. Soldiers or people who have complaints about things going wrong in the military can complain to the Service Complaints Ombudsman, or they can complain to their MP. And confidentiality is an important part of the military, but also the right to talk to your MP about things going wrong is a right which is jealously guarded. Otherwise, what preoccupies a lot of the Armed Forces Act 2006 is mechanisms for ensuring obedience of soldiers. They are subordinate, and if we take just a couple of examples in sections 12 and 19, there are offences for disobedience or for failing to follow lawful commands. If you don't follow a lawful command, then you can be court-martialed. There are no strikes, several bodies of law, but the Incitement to Disaffection Act 1934 bans strikes in the military, just as the Police Act 1996 restricts strikes amongst the police force. Now then we've got the governance of the arms dealers and the exporters. So there are two main companies for the UK. First is BAE Systems, which we've already mentioned. In 2023, it had $29 billion in arms revenues. The UK government, as I mentioned, has a golden share. The other big company is mainly civilian aviation, but it also does military manufacturing, and that's Airbus, which is a Societas European company form, but basically the equivalent of a PLC in the UK. They operate under a licensing system, so most of the work that they do exporting arms is subject to control by the government under the 2002 Act. You need a license. That license can be revoked and conditions can be attached. Under the Firearms Act, there are bans on automatic weapons and rockets, but there is another licensing system for firearms. If you are a private security enterprise, then you've got to get a license through the 2001 Act for designated activities such as manned guarding. Private military contractors, however, are largely self-regulated. There's a big void, certainly at an international level, and that's why the International Code of Conduct for Private Security Providers was passed in 2010, 1/3 British, but mainly these companies are under self-regulation. Then we've got the United States. So, these are really the big players in military around the world. As I say, BAE Systems is number 7, but you've got the big 5 in America, potentially going to be challenged in coming years, but they are the leading players for now and for the time being. They're all incorporated in Delaware. They all have one share, one vote structures, and their biggest investors are the typical usual suspects on Wall Street: BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. So the biggest is Lockheed Martin, $60 billion revenue in 2003 from selling arms. Then we've got Raytheon, or RTX as it's called now, $40 billion. Northrop Grumman, Boeing, which also does civil aviation, but a big military component. General Dynamics. The ones to watch are probably the startups, particularly coming out of Silicon Valley. So the leading and most attention-seeking one is called Anduril, which is named after a sword in The Lord of the Rings. So 2.1 billion was the revenue of Anduril in 2025. It's growing fast. In its specializing in putting artificial intelligence systems into military equipment. It's got a charismatic CEO, Lucky Palmer, who invented the Oculus Rift, which was released by Meta or Facebook. He was sacked from Facebook for donating to Trump. Zuckerberg denies that, but probably better to believe Palmer than Zuckerberg on this one. But there's some really disturbing, concerning tendencies that this company and this CEO are showing. For instance, Palmer says we need the US to transition from being the world police to being the world gun store. And so you have the unification of military manufacturer with a high-powered philosophy of making lots of money, move fast and break things, sort of Silicon Valley attitude, no restraints about putting artificial intelligence into weapons, creating autonomous weapon systems. And of course, that leads us to what the other big tech companies are doing now. There is regulation in the United States, like the UK, the Gun Control Act, the Arms Export Control Act, but really we're operating in a largely regulatory free zone when it comes to war. In the war in Iran, we are seeing artificial intelligence being deployed for weapons that, according to one Guardian article, can kill people quicker than the speed of thought. So the platform being deployed is one set up under a project called Project Maven. This is code name. And artificial intelligence is being used to do 4 out of the 6 steps of what we call the kill chain. So if you want to bomb someone, you want to kill them, you've first of all got to identify them, you've got to locate them, you've got to work out whether they're a lawful target. You've got to prioritize them amongst different targets. You've got to assign weapons, and then you've got to fire. And according to the latest stories, artificial intelligence is now performing the first 4 of those things. So in the first days in the bombing of Iran, thousands of targets were struck in a very, very small space of time. Instead of having a team of 2,000 human researchers, you just have a very small number, and they can bomb an awful lot of people, including, remember, a children's school, killing 176 children in the first days of the bombing. So that's what AI is doing at the moment. We've got lots of partners from Silicon Valley all jumping into the gravy train, getting a piece of the action. So Amazon Web Services is providing the data cloud capacity for Project Maven. Google got involved up until 2018 when its staff launched a protest against military involvement. It pulled out, but then went back in under its CEO in 2021. Palantir, led by Peter Thiel, is involved since 2017. Microsoft and its cloud services, Azure, since 2018. You've got Anduril. And the one that's hit the news recently is Anthropic, that does Claude. Was involved from 2024 up until 2026, but the Department of Defense, because Anthropic said it didn't want to kill too many people or do mass domestic surveillance, was designated as a supply chain risk by Peter Hegseth, the Department of War Secretary of State, last month. But Claude is still being used, Anthropic is still being used, until its contract expires in a few months' time. Now, remember the EU AI Act from last week, Article 2.3, says that the military is completely exempt from its regulation on risks. So this is a regulation-free zone. What robots could be done, what large language models could be used, how robots, large language models could be used in the military is completely unbound by law at the moment. It is up to the discretion of people in charge and the big tech companies and men like Pete Hegseth. Stephen Hawking, who of course is one of the world's great physicists, late physicists, the early 20th century, late 20th century, argued before he died in 2016 that alongside the benefits, AI will also bring dangers like powerful autonomous weapons or new ways for the few to oppress the many. It will bring great disruption to our economy, and in the future AI could develop a will of its own, a will that is in conflict of ours. And he called for a ban on autonomous offensive weapons along with a lot of other people in 2015, but that ban certainly has not been implemented yet. On the contrary, we've got a war being fought right now in Iran with all of the horrors that AI in warfare might bring. Okay, so lastly, human rights, and I want to address 3 that come into play here: the right to security, the right to life, and a right to peace. I think it's important to see that rights and military power are in a great deal of tension with one another, because the use of force is almost the antithesis to the use of law. Nevertheless, we see in the European Convention, Article 5, there is a right to security of the person. But remember the Melian dialogue in the history of the Peloponnesian War. The Armed Forces Covenant in 2014 says the first duty of government is defence of the realm. But this is not a duty that results in individual rights being enforceable, even if the Armed Forces Covenant was in fact a law. It doesn't create any rights in court. So if citizens in the UK are being killed by a foreign aggressor, there is no right in court that we can claim to. Our right of security depends on the political process. And what is interpreted as being security and national security is really up to the executive, or it seems to be up to the executive to define. So, for instance, in Chandler and the Department of Public Prosecutions, or Director of Public Prosecutions, there were claims by protesters who argued that the US Air Force and nuclear weapons being stationed in the UK was a threat to national security. So they protested the air base, they were arrested, and the House of Lords rejected their claims that they were acting in defence of national security. It's the government that gets to define what national security is. That's inside the UK. Outside the UK, we can see that there's no right to any security of any particular level at all in a case like China Navigation and the Attorney General. So this was a case about an English shipping company that requested armed guards against pirates, and when they were told they had to pay for it, they agreed to pay the government, the Navy, money for protection. After they got the protection, they claimed that they should not need to pay because they argued that they had a right to protection from the Navy anyway and therefore shouldn't need to fork out any money. And the Court of Appeal held that the Crown did have the right to be paid because it had no prior duty to give military protection and could agree to give protection on any terms, on any basis which it saw fit. Okay, so not much there in the right to security when we're talking about the military. There's also the right to life, and we see this listed in Article 2 of the European Convention. But to what extent is the right to life actually enforceable through tort law or through criminal law? If you're injured by somebody who is in the army, then the Crown Proceedings Act, Armed Forces Act of 1987 says that you can bring a claim in tort for injury or death, but under Section 2, the Secretary of State may have immunity or can plead that they have immunity if actions have been taken due to an imminent national danger or any great emergency needing warlike operations. The military personnel can be held responsible in criminal law. The Crown and Clegg in 1995 is a leading case that switched the line of case law up till then, that people shot by soldiers would have no claim at all. This is about a soldier who shot the passenger of a car in the back as the car drove away, and the soldier was found to be guilty of murder. And outside the UK, in occupied Iraq, we have the Al-Skaini case and the Secretary of State for Defence. This was about 5 claimants who'd been shot dead by British troops in Basra, and then there was a 6th claimant who was tortured and then beaten to death. The House of Lords and the European Court of Human Rights held that they were under the UK's jurisdiction, and whenever the state exercises control or authority over an individual, regardless of whether it's got control over the whole territory, but if they're exercising control over an individual, it must secure the entire range of substantive rights. So compensation claims can be brought for death and torture as a violation of human rights. Ministry of Defence in Iraqi civilians case saw people have less luck because they were out of time claiming. 3 years to claim, said the Supreme Court in that case. Finally, what about a right to peace? Well, there's not a right as such that is possible to litigate through court. This really depends, again, on the political process, but at a higher level of international politics. So the foundations of the system for peace that we have today really begin with the United Nations Charter. So there's 3 main parts to this. First, Article 2.3 of the UN Charter says that states should settle international disputes by peaceful means, not by bombing each other, and they should refrain in Article 2.4 from the threat or use of force against political dependents of any state. And that is really the key norm for the whole international system, the ban on aggressive war. And if we go back before this, We saw all attempts to regulate the conduct of wars. The idea that you would have to declare war was this idea that war should be regulated, but a simple ban on aggressive war has been the foundation for international law since the Second World War, and is so important that it's still there. Even when it's broken, what countries often try to do is dress up what they are doing illegally through the modes of legality. So when you look at the Iraq War, Tony Blair tried to argue that they still had authority to bomb Iraq based on the revival of a UN Security Council resolution from the First Gulf War. With Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the pretext was supposed to be that the Donbass region, eastern parts of Ukraine, and Luhansk had lawfully separated, and the Russian invasion was coming to their assistance. So it was a war of self-defense. I'm not sure if the Trump administration is saying anything about why they're bombing Iran and whether they're going to try and justify that. I mean, they say it's about a nuclear weapon. But even in the breach, we see the rules being affirmed. And this idea on the ban of aggressive war is still a foundational part of the international order. Then we've got Article 42, which says that, you can have the use of force if it's authorized by the Security Council. The Security Council may take such an action by air, sea, or land forces as may be necessary to maintain or restore international peace and security. The problem, of course, as we know, that the permanent members of the Security Council, the US, the UK, France, Russia, and China, often are not going to agree, mainly because China and Russia are authoritarian regimes, and the United States is increasingly unhinged under the Trump government. Article 51 says that nothing shall impair the inherent right of individual collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs. Taken together, no aggressive war, but Security Council can order peacekeeping missions and the use of force, but nothing stops individual or collective self-defense. Worth adding that the use of nuclear weapons is probably illegal, although the International Court of Justice didn't completely rule it out. And the UN Secretary General at the moment is calling for a ban on lethal autonomous weapons without human oversight. So that's what we've got at the moment, and there's a lot more, obviously, that we need to do. So some reform options, I think, could be usefully listed as the following. First one is just don't launch an aggressive war. Iraq is the most obvious example from the perspective of the UK and the US. For the US, it ended up costing around $3 trillion. If you look at the disaster in Ukraine, that's probably not going to be seen for very long as a good thing for Russia and Vladimir Putin to have done. So many people dead, but the economy in a appalling state as a result of it. Launching aggressive wars is not a good idea. Even if you don't like the country that you really want to invade, you're probably not going to get a better result in the regime by bombing it. You can't drop democracy from 30,000 feet in the sky. Second group of reforms, I think we can start with what Kant said and complete the things left outstanding from Kant's article on perpetual peace. So the first measure that we would need to preempt conflict is to cancel debts between countries. So start by cancelling the debt of the poorest countries, a lot of those in sub-Saharan Africa, which has been riven by conflict. Move investment in instead to ensure that people have resources so that young men and women don't need to pick up guns and fight for survival, that instead that they can lead fulfilling lives. Phase out sovereign debt altogether with more international investment and aid. Secondly, pass a treaty to dispose of the materials for war. And I think implicitly, if you are doing, as Kant said, disposing of the materials for war, you want to take away the profit motive from military construction and arms dealing. Because military enterprise driven by profit is going to want to expand. That's the opposite of what we need to do, which is dispose of materials for war. So expand what we've already got from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, get rid of nuclear weapon stockpiles or biological chemical weapons. But then, really the biggest killers around the world is landmines and AK-47s. So getting rid of all of these weapons gradually, I think, has got to be a good long-term objective. And thirdly, phase out standing armies by redirecting money to free, clean energy, health, education, and full employment. And of course, this really has to be done by treaties. There's no easy way about it. You don't want unilateral disarmament, but that has to be a realistic objective for any credible and sentient government that does believe in the future of a civilized society. Third, halt any supply of arms to countries that do engage in wars where there are war crimes systematically being committed. So two obvious examples very recently is Saudi Arabia's appalling war crimes in Yemen, mass starvation, including of children population, and Israel's retaliation after the appalling October 9th attacks by Hamas. Israel retaliates, but then, of course, engages in a scorched earth policy of displacing the whole population of Gaza. And that is why, with the alleged intent to do so and displace the population, and that is why the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for the Hamas and Netanyahu leadership. So don't export any more arms to states that engage in war crimes or launch aggressive wars. That would now include Russia and the United States, given its latest ventures, particularly in Iran, or countries that systematically violate international law. Fourthly, pass an equivalent of the UAP Disclosure Act of 2023 that the Americans proposed, because no doubt the British government has some material as well, given the number of sightings that have been documented over the years, originally known as Foo Fighters in the Second World War. And whatever there is, open it up for public science and research rather than keeping everything a military secret. And finally, ban autonomous artificial intelligence weapons in the military. It's more likely that you get authoritarian governments that you don't like transitioning to being social democracies when people's living standards rise than they are likely to do by a lot more spending on war. So at a time when wars often seem inevitable and it often seems like we're racing to a new era of rearmament, we just got to remember the long course of history that we're actually on a trajectory to more peace, less war, less military spending, more human development. And that's the trajectory that we should really try and continue to be on.